Cecil. Good morning, my lady. May I please call Claire Lombardelli?
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Lombardelli. If you could just state your name, please.
Claire Lombardelli.
Thank you. A few preliminary matters, if I may. Firstly, can I invite you to keep your voice up? Secondly, you may have noticed that people are taking a note, including a stenographer, actually. So we will take things a little more slowly than we may otherwise do. I'm particularly bad at going fast, I'm afraid, so I will try to slow down, and if you can do the same. And please do ask me to repeat anything if it's not clear or if you don't understand a question. Now, as I say, thank you for attending today and assisting the inquiry. You have provided an 18-page statement to the inquiry that ends 251931. As we can see at the outset, it states that it's dated the 22nd of August 2023. But if we go to the last page at page 18, that's the page that contains declaration of truth at the bottom, the statement of truth, and it's dated the 23rd of August of 2023. It's just a typo on the first page. And if I can just confirm with you that everything within your witness statement is true.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, you are now the chief economist with the OECD, and I understand that you took up that position in May 2023, earlier this year.
That's right.
But your statement, and indeed your evidence today, is concerned with the role that you played during the pandemic. And if I can just ask you, what was your role during the pandemic?
So I was the Chief Economic Advisor at the Treasury during the pandemic, and that role consisted of a number of things. So I was responsible overall for the economic analysis that the Treasury did and fed into the process for COVID, responsible for all of the economic matters in that sense, not the policies, I should say. I also was responsible for liaising across the, we have a sort of macroeconomic framework in the public sector that provides advice, analysis and takes decisions on economic policy. That is a combination of the Treasury, the Bank of England, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the ONS, the Debt Management Office. I was responsible for liaising on behalf of the Treasury with all of those functions, and I also jointly ran the Government Economic Service through this period.
Thank you. I'm going to break those down in a little bit in due course.
And if you could go more slowly, please. Don't worry.
But you will be aware that there are a number of later modules that are going to be dealing with various aspects of the Treasury's response to the pandemic. And for today, and for the purposes of Module 2, we're going to be exploring some of the economic analysis that you were involved in and the modelling at a high level, the input of the Treasury into core decision making, some of the different schemes, and then also consideration of economic version of SAGE or something of that nature. So just so that you know where we're going. There are also a number of other witness statements that have been provided by various officials and civil servants and indeed ministers within the Treasury, and of course the inquiry will have regard to those as well. So if I can just deal then briefly, if I may, with your role as the Chief Economic Advisor. You touched on it when you just described the various aspects in terms of your remit. But effectively, you're the primary advisor to the Chancellor. Is that correct, on macroeconomic and fiscal issues?
Correct, on macroeconomic and fiscal issues, yes.
And if you can just break it down for the assistance of those that are following, what are macroeconomic issues and what are fiscal issues?
Of course. Macroeconomic issues are basically the economy as a whole and the elements within that. So things like the level of activity, the amount of unemployment, inflation, those sorts of cross-economy issues. Looking in detail at things like the labour market and the like. Fiscal issues are basically the overall level of government spending, taxation and borrowing in the economy. And so overall this is a sort of focusing on the big picture of overall what is happening in the economy.
Thank you. And in relation to your role, prior to becoming, in fact, the Director General and the Chief Economic Advisor, you were the Director of Strategy, Planning and Budget, is that right?
That's correct.
And that has a slightly different role and remit within the Treasury.
Yes.
And is far more policy-based.
Yes, the Director of Strategy Planning and Budget basically oversees the budget process in the Treasury, and what they do is they coordinate the Treasury's policies for the budget, and that would mean liaising with all the different teams in the budget for fiscal events. And actually, during COVID, that was the team that coordinated the Treasury's response to COVID, and also interacted with the sort of the rest of the government who was dealing with, you know, the decision making in the process. So they would have been the primary contact, for example, for the Cabinet Office.
Indeed. And in short, the Treasury uses a group structure to organise its work, and that is one of the primary groups, and as you said, led on the Covid-19 work.
That's correct.
Thank you. Alongside that, you also oversaw the work of the economics group, so a separate group
Yes.
to the strategy planning and budget group. And that was also heavily involved, is that fair to say, in the Treasury's response?
Yes, heavily. The economics group was the group that brought together the overall economic analysis of COVID, what was happening, and made those assessments.
Indeed, you also, in your capacity there, you attended various cross-governmental meetings, including those with the Chancellor and on occasion with core decision makers such as the Prime Minister. Is that right?
Yes, I attended cross-government meetings where the economic analysis or evidence would have a particular role in the meeting, or its interpretation would.
Now, if I may turn to the broader approach within Her Majesty's Treasury, as it was at the time, with regard to economic analysis and modelling, just touching briefly, if I may, on data analysis, first of all. I appreciate that in your statement how you set out there's data analysis, and then there's also the economic modelling tools that were utilised. You explain they're distinct, but there's a significant amount of overlap. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I would say we for the economic analysis that we did, I think there are, you know, I could break it down into probably 5 areas in terms of what we were looking at. There was data and analysis, what was going on and where we got that. There was the modelling that we undertook at the Treasury and with others. We did a lot of, as I mentioned at the start, working with other aspects of the system across the public sector who were also doing data analysis and modelling, so we shared our information and knowledge there. We did a lot of looking at other countries, what other countries were doing, because, you know, in some cases, unfortunately, they were further ahead in the virus, and so we could learn from them. And also some external, we talked a lot to externals outside the public sector. But in terms of modelling and data analysis, you're right, there's this interdependency between the two.
And indeed, the questions I'm going to ask you predominantly focus on those 2 areas. Other aspects are for other later modules, effectively. But just perhaps to touch on those very briefly, you reference international work that was being undertaken. The Her Majesty's Treasury, as I say, as it was at the time, also utilised in the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, other forms of data in that respect of modelling.
That's right, that's right.
But if I may then turn to data and evidence, and if I can call up page 5 of your statement and paragraph 14, you explain the changes that took place with regard to data. As I say, it's at paragraph 14 at the top, and you explain that due to the speed, scale and scope of the economic impact of the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, you supplemented traditional economic data with additional data sources that were already available, gave a more rapid and real-time picture of economic activity. You then go on to give some examples, such as Google Maps, Citymapper, Open Table, effectively restaurant booking data, those types of things there. You then talk separately about credit card usage, so spending in short term, with regard to the economy. Now, in respect of all of those types of data, did Her Majesty's Treasury consider data on social health impacts alongside this? Was that a form of data that was also being collated and fed in, or was it very much based on, as I say, the more economic position?
The Treasury and our analysis was more based on the economics. I mean, that is our sort of area of expertise and knowledge. Other departments will have been looking at other data sources. What we did do is we very closely used and were aware of the data on health and the data that was coming out of the Department of Health and related on how the virus was developing, because, of course, that was having an impact on the economy. But on the sort of more social issues. I mean, we would also have, for example, looked at schools insofar as, because we were doing modelling of, for example, what would happen and have, the proportion of parents in the labour market. So there was lots of evidence early on, certainly before restrictions were brought in, that people were beginning to adapt their behaviour anyway, and that's why we were looking at some of these indicators like Google Maps, City Mapper, Open Table, but a much wider range to try and work out what behaviours people were doing, irrespective of whether or not there were any restrictions, just in response to the virus and their fear of the virus. So we looked at a range. I mean, some of these, as you see, are not economic data sources in and of themselves. I mean, in a sense, Google Maps is a social data source as well. So, insofar as data was useful to tell us about the economy, we looked at it, even if it wasn't hard economic data, if that makes sense.
Would it be fair to say, or a fair analysis, that it was really looking at things such as you say, impact on workforce, those sorts of aspects, impact in terms of socialising, spending within the economy, whether that be restaurants, bars, patterns of movement and transport, those sorts of issues?
Yeah, I would say workforce and economic activity. Some of these issues were more about, like you say, the card spending data, for example, is just the level of economic activity in the economy. We were also, and I should say, and I reference it there, talking a lot to the Department for Business, who will have had a lot of information. At this point, probably quite soft information, so, conversations and that, but they would have had intelligence on what was happening at businesses as well and how businesses were looking at this.
Thank you. Now I want to move to modelling. And modelling posed particular challenges for HMT during the pandemic. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, modelling is always a challenge, I should say. I mean, very much with modelling, you sort of get out, what the outputs you get are a function of what you put into it, and there's always a lot of uncertainty about the economy. But at this point, throughout the entire pandemic, the level of uncertainty was obviously much higher than typical economic modellers would be used to.
Indeed. And that uncertainty resulted in modelling perhaps not being utilised to the same extent as it had been previously. Would that be fair?
I wouldn't say it wasn't used as much as it had been previously. We did actually use quite a lot of modelling. I would say it was a less reliable source of information than the data and the information and analysis of what was actually happening in the economy. Because, if you think about what economic and modelling tends to do, what it does is it looks at existing relationships between variables, and it sort of tries to apply those going forward. What was happening in the pandemic is the very basics of the economic relationships that we have was changing and were coming under pressure. So previous estimations of, for example, the relationship between unemployment and output will be very different under these sorts of circumstances. So I wouldn't say we used it less. We did actually use it quite a lot. It was a less reliable source of information. There was a lot more uncertainty around it than there normally would be.
And certainly a lot less emphasis, therefore, placed on those models.
That's right. We wouldn't have used it as, for example, a reliable basis on which you could solely decide policy. We would say it's very important to supplement it with lots of other information to give you a fuller picture.
It's very difficult to change one's speech pattern, but if you could slow down.
Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you. And part of that was as a consequence of the pre-pandemic position, in that there had been very limited consideration given to the consequences in terms of modelling or data collection or those sorts of issues with respect to a pandemic situation. I think you set that out, don't you? It's at page 7, paragraph 24 of your statement. And that, as a consequence, had limitations there then for modelling in the pandemic, because there was no playbook, as you described it.
That's right. We didn't have a model. We didn't, going into the pandemic, we didn't have a model of how the pandemic would affect the economy. As I set out in my statement, it would have been incredibly difficult to do that because the impact that the pandemic had on the economy was very much dependent on the particular parameters of that pandemic, the rate of transmission and those sorts of things. So it would have been very difficult in advance to know what those would have been.
And indeed, you gave a speech on the 29th of June last year at King's College. And in that, you described that the purpose of that was because you wanted to share how you did not have that ready-made toolkit to hand to model the effects of lockdown and effectively the known unknowns were a formidable barrier to any reliable predictive capability. And if I can just pull up your speech for a moment, page 6, and it's 88016. Page 6, please. I'm looking halfway down the page, and this is where you've already touched upon the uncertainties that you were faced with, and as a consequence, the models not being, or certainly the Treasury not being as confident in the outputs effectively. And what you explain here is that the uncertainty meant it was not possible to meaningfully model the overall economic cost of lockdown for 2 reasons. You go on that first, to estimate the cost of an intervention, you have to know what would happen in the absence of that intervention. It wasn't possible to know what would have happened to the virus if there had been no lockdown, and you couldn't have known how the economy, how people and businesses would have responded to the virus without a lockdown. There was no reasonable counterfactual. Now, from this, is it right that there was no meaningful modelling of the impact of lockdown, the first lockdown?
I wouldn't say there was no meaningful modelling. There was a lot of analysis and modelling that happened. What I would say is there was no estimated cost of a lockdown, if you like. There was no way to basically say a lockdown will cost you X, or indeed a lockdown of this form will cost you X, but of a different form will cost you Y. But I think it's a bit too far to say there was no meaningful modelling done. There was a lot of useful modelling. One of the examples I referenced earlier was, for example, if you were to close schools, you can from that understand, if you look at where parents work in the economy, for example, you can see what the impact of that would be if they can no longer work, and those sorts of things. But what there wasn't was an estimate of, the lockdown will cost X in terms of jobs or economic activity.
Indeed, and that's the first reason that you explain. And as you can see from that, you explain that there's also no reasonable counterfactual. Yeah. So against that, similarly, in terms of the overall economic cost of lockdown, there's no modelling of the overall economic cost of not locking down. It's fair to say that there is no neutral option when it comes to making a choice. Each choice, whether it's lockdown or not, would have a consequence.
That's right. And as I mentioned at the start, what we saw was even before restrictions were being considered, people were adapting their economic behaviour, and they were adapting it quite substantially, and that was having an impact on economic activity, on particular sectors in the economy and you like. So it was it would have been incredibly difficult, as you say, in the absence of a lockdown. There would have been a significant economic impact from the virus, and actually there are various estimates of what that might have been, but incredibly hard to put a particular number on it.
And that's a theme that comes through both in your speech, as we can see when we move on to the second reason that you give, but also more generally within your statement. You speak about the uncertainty of behaviour of people and businesses in relation to how they would respond to restrictions, no past episodes to provide reasonable approximations of what the economy and individuals were going through. And you explain a really critical point, the way the economy responded changed over time. You go on to say, actually, it had an ability to learn and adapt, and you give some examples of that there. But one of the big blocks for the Treasury, from your perspective, was that of behaviour from individuals and being unable to predict behaviour. Is that right?
That's right. That was a huge sort of challenge to the analysis and the inability to estimate precisely what the impacts would be. Behaviour was a key driver. I mean, in the economy, behaviour is always a key driver of outcomes, and of course it was particularly uncertain at this time. And an important point I make there is that it changed, and people's responses to the same sort of restriction changed over time.
And you also distinguish between voluntary behaviours and compulsory restrictions of impacting on behaviour. So effectively the counterfactual position of, if there is not a lockdown, what voluntary behaviours would there be in any event? If there is a mandated lockdown, then what non-voluntary or restricted behaviours would take place. And that's the same position when it came to the second and third lockdowns as well, with regard to being unable to model the overall economic impact of either way.
Yes.
And indeed, the autumn of 2020, when there was consideration of circuit breakers, the same position arose. It was Treasury's position was you were unable to calculate out the overall economic impact of a circuit breaker. Is that right?
That's right. It would have been impossible to put a specific sort of figure or number on that with any reliability. What we were able to do, and what we did do, was lots of analysis on the sorts of what the economic impact, the sorts of economic impacts there could be, and what you might see for different restrictions.
And if I could just bring up the briefing for the COVID Strategy Committee on the 21st of September of 2020, it's INQ 184589, please. What we have here is, as it says at the outset, a briefing paper. It's very much from the Treasury perspective. And if I can go to the second bullet point, what is said here is, more generally, we are reaching the limits of what we can do economically, with further measures likely to be catastrophic. We need a strategy that works over the winter period rather than tinkering with restrictions week to week. But if I go to the final page, please, what we have set out there is an annex that deals with the economic impact of the circuit breaker. And it sets out, in general terms, that it's likely to be severe, reducing revenues rather than costs. It explains about the GDP dropping. It continues to go on, and this is some of the uncertainty perhaps that you've already alluded to, that although the exact impact would depend on the type of restrictions imposed, analysis on monthly effects of the previous lockdown serve as a reasonable proxy. Can't suggest the circuit breaker will concentrate its impacts on firms already in distress. Go on to speak about hospitality, domestic employers, arts, entertainment, recreation, construction, furlough, sectors effectively that are likely to be impacted by a circuit breaker, high employment sectors with vulnerable workforces. And then finally, it goes on to talk about cash conversion, sales, revenue, and retail. But nowhere in this document is there any analysis of the opposite counterfactual scenario, is there?
It doesn't look like in this particular document, no.
So what's going to COVID-S is not a position where economic advice is presented. This is the consequence or potential consequences of a circuit breaker now, and here, on the other hand, are the potential consequences if there is no circuit breaker. What we have is the Treasury adopting a clear line in terms of the impacts of a potential circuit breaker, and as we see, severe, catastrophic, that sort of language. Is that right?
Yes, I mean what I don't know, and we don't know, is what the specific commission was that this is responding to, and what the other papers that would have been, and I'm sure the inquiry would have them. I mean, it obviously would have depended, and there would have been a huge amount of analysis going, I assume, to this decision around what the impact on the virus would be of the two, and we were providing huge amounts of evidence and analysis throughout this period on overall what the impact of the virus was in terms of the impacts on economic activity. So there would have been other analysis going on around what the sort of baseline was in terms of the levels of economic activity that were happening at the time, and that would have been affected by the level of the virus at the time.
Of course, but this is the advice that's going to the Chancellor in relation to his attendance at that meeting and the line that he ought to be taking at that meeting. Perhaps if we can just call up page 2 of it for a moment. We see at the top, we suggest you push back strongly on the circuit breaker proposal. The economic impacts would be severe. It talks about firm failures and redundancies, and then continues to say there's no evidence a circuit breaker of 2 to 3 weeks will only be enforced for that long, meaning we could end up lifting restrictions when half data could still be going in the wrong direction because of lag time. There's a very clear piece of advice here coming out of Treasury to the Chancellor in relation to the circuit breaker that was going to be discussed in that September meeting. Did that reflect the general position within Treasury at the time with regard to its approach to lockdowns and circuit breakers, that these were profound measures that had significant impacts and unacceptable impacts on the economy and so needed to be pushed back against?
I think everyone in the Treasury was incredibly worried about the impacts on health, on life, and the loss of life, the potential for the NHS to be overwhelmed, and throughout the pandemic. That we were also aware of all the harms that were going to be caused, and our role in the process was to provide evidence and analysis on the economic impact, so that they could then be fed into a wider process in which these issues were sort of weighed up and the decisions decided. The role of the Chancellor was to provide the information about the economy and the economic impact. And so that is what this document and others will have been doing, is provide him with the evidence on the proposal that was being considered, which was the circuit breaker at this time, and the economic evidence. Other evidence would have been provided by others in the process.
But what you don't have within this paper, as an example, is that counterfactual position or an analysis of other alternative measures.
I think I haven't seen the whole paper. I'm sure what the economic advice would often stress throughout was that the virus itself was causing huge economic harm. It may have been in this paper, it may have been in other papers, but we were regularly clear on the uncertainty that the impacts would have, and also that the virus itself was having huge economic impacts, and the best thing for the economy was clearly to control the virus and to limit the virus. I think that was that will have been consistently through advice. I don't know about this particular paper.
But in terms of the view within Treasury, was there ever support for that circuit breaker, to the best of your knowledge?
I wouldn't know. I don't know. The Treasury did not have a pre-proposed position on restrictions. What we were trying to do was provide the economic analysis and evidence that was going to feed into the process to make the right decisions. Clearly, where restrictions could control the virus, that could be beneficial to the economy because it was the virus itself that was causing damage. Obviously, throughout time and throughout the process, that will have varied. But we were very, very aware that the virus itself was a huge problem for the economy and needed to be controlled.
How did you consider the definition of circuit breaker? Is it short-term lockdown? Is that how you would have understood a circuit breaker?
With apologies, I was responsible for the economic analysis that was feeding in the precise policy that's being considered here. I'm not sure. I think the general understanding of a circuit breaker was short. I don't know if this particular paper was written in response to a very specific policy proposal or a more general description of a circuit breaker, I'm afraid.
Perhaps if I can pick up on something else that you've alluded to just a moment ago, that it was essentially for the Chancellor to make the economic case. Was there the view, therefore, that he would be making the economic case, the Health Secretary would make the case in relation to health, and other individuals, then schools, for example, the Minister for Education? Was it siloed in that way?
No,
and be synthesised within the Cabinet Office?
I mean, it was the case that it was the case that different departments have different expertise and have different objectives in terms of the things they care about. In the Treasury, obviously, we were incredibly concerned about the economy and the economic impact, as is our role, and other departments have responsibility for other aspects of public services. And it was for decision makers together to make those choices and when they occurred, trade-offs about how do you manage this level of harm across across the decision making. That was how that was what we it was the role of the Cabinet Office to bring those things together and to be the place where all of the information is synthesised and these different issues, whether it's across the economy, education, inequalities, all of those very important factors. We all recognise that all of these factors were incredibly important and that decision makers would need information across all of them to make those really hard judgments.
Did it make it harder, though, with regard to the fact that effectively the Cabinet Office was being presented with these binary options? You had the Treasury making the economic case, you had the Health Secretary making the health case, and no real effort to engage across those disciplines between the departments.
I mean, you would have to ask that. I wouldn't characterise it as binary. As I say, the economic analysis and evidence very much recognised and factored in the fact that the virus itself was what was causing huge damage to the economy. And actually, there's a range of estimates now available about how much of this would have been voluntary and how much how much as a result of restrictions, and the uncertainty around that. So the Treasury was sort of well aware that the virus itself was causing huge damage to the economy. In terms of the process question you asked, I mean, it is the role of the Cabinet Office to bring together all of this information and to synthesise it. And, in this case, it would have been particularly challenging to do that.
Now, you may be aware there has been criticism of the Treasury with regard to it being tactical in how it shared its economic analysis. So essentially putting forward that analysis where it was considered that it would advance a Treasury objective, just because we've just seen it, for example, in relation to the circuit breaker paper that we've seen, the briefing for the Chancellor there. What do you have to say about that? Was information and economic analysis shared freely, or was it shared when it was in advance of a policy proposal that Treasury sought to advance?
We shared our economic analysis and evidence very, very freely with everyone. That to ensure it was feeding into the decisions as it needed to. So we shared, in two ways. So we produced a huge amount of economic analysis that we obviously shared with the Chancellor, so he was fully informed, and we also fed it directly into the Cabinet Office process, and the Cabinet Office were responsible for synthesising the data and analysis. We did also share it around Whitehall with other departments that had economic interest. We had, for example, weekly notes that were going around on those sorts of things, and of course we shared it more broadly across the public sector with other parts of the economic sort of framework. We were in constant discussions with, for example, the Bank of England, the OBR, and the like. But we fed all of the analysis and the information that we had into those Cabinet Office processes so that they could serve the joint decision-making process.
Now, it's right that nobody else was providing that economic analysis aside from the Treasury during that period.
That's right. We were bringing together the economic analysis. We were using and building on a lot of information and analysis from other parts of the public sector that we were talking to and had good relations with. They shared their information with us, and so we brought it together. And then it was the Treasury that were responsible for inputting that. In some cases, we did that jointly with some economic functions in the Cabinet Office as well.
And with regard to transparency, similarly, you'll be aware, because of the materials that have been provided to you, there have been criticisms in relation to the Treasury's modelling, analysis and advice not being published or made accessible to whether it be other government departments, SAGE, for example, or more broadly, actually. And we can compare perhaps the position of SAGE, where those minutes of the meetings and the modelling and the analysis was published. Do you consider that transparency would be something that would be desirable in relation to the economic modelling and advice in hindsight?
Transparency is always, it is a good thing. It helps you, get other input and views on what you're doing. And we did share our modelling and our analysis, particularly with, as I say, the other parts of the economic framework we use in the UK. We have a very, unlike SAGE, I would say, in the UK we have a very established setup for how we do economic analysis and policy making. SAGE, understandably and rightly, is convened in emergencies to add capability and capacity where it doesn't exist. So in this case, bringing epidemiology and virology expertise to the Department of Health and the wider government decision-making process. Slightly different on economics, I would say, in that we do have a specialist capacity in the Treasury to analyse the economy. We do have specialist capacity in the Bank of England, in the Office of Budget Responsibility, and so on and so forth. So there is some capacity and expertise that is designed to do the monitoring of the economy and provide analysis and evidence. Could we have done more to make it more systematic? Perhaps, but I don't think they're quite. There are differences in the way we have the system, and we have got quite a robust macroeconomic framework that we use. On transparency, we did publish some analysis, more than we normally do, as you'll have seen. Obviously, at fiscal events, we publish evidence. The government published quite a lot of analysis through the pandemic, and that included economic analysis. And of course, the Office of Budget Responsibility are responsible for publishing outlooks on the UK economy, and they published more during this period. But it wasn't with the frequency with which, for example, SAGE papers and minutes were published.
It was a fraction in comparatively to what SAGE published. But what is your view in relation to whether that material ought to be published? We'll turn to looking at other ways of assessing the economic impacts and filtering that through in a moment. But with regard to publishing and making and being more transparent, is it desirable to have that advice published?
I think it's difficult. I mean, as you've seen in some of the examples, it's quite difficult to separate out the economic much of the economic analysis was part of the policy making process and was feeding into the policy decisions. I think it is very important that ministers and officials have a space where they can, have free and frank discussions and share information about policy. And I do think it's quite hard to, there's a reason that we've always had the space for policy making to be able to happen privately for ministers.
Let me just interrupt you there. Let's put policy making to one side and discuss modelling and data analysis in the same types of papers that you see coming out of SAGE, in short. Not necessarily the discussions on policy with the trade-offs either way and the advice to ministers, but the models and the analysis that was undertaken by Treasury.
Yeah, I mean, we did expose them to quite a lot of, we shared them quite broadly and got input, as I say, for people. Could we have done that more? I mean, potentially, and maybe that would improve the quality of the modelling, and we have we're sort of not precious about that. I guess the question I would have is whether or not it would. Well, yeah, I mean, you could do that. Our primary focus at this time, and being frank, it was a pressurised time, was to ensure that ministers and decision makers had the best information available. That was what we spent our sort of time and effort and energy on. We could have ministers could decide to publish more and share more, and we could do that.
Is there any risk to sharing more?
I think. No, I mean, I leaving aside the point I was making earlier about, I think it's quite hard to separate out in some of these issues, what's policy advice and what's analysis. I guess the practical risk, being frank, was we had limited time. It was an exceptionally busy period. Everyone was working round the clock. If you are also on top of that, thinking about publication schedules and what you publish and handling the responses to that. But being frank, we would have had less time to do the actual analysing of what was going on and less time to talk to ministers about it. So I think that is one of the concerns about that. But in terms of the sort of modelling where it's separable from policy, you certainly could.
Now, just dealing with site across government and indeed other organisations or committees, just touching on SAGE for a moment, one repeated theme coming through from the SAGE minutes, as you would have seen, is that SAGE were not dealing with the economic impacts, but there was an understanding, and it was recorded, that Treasury were. And indeed, you were asked about one of those meetings, and it's the 58th meeting of SAGE on the 21st of September 2020, so again, the same sort of time as the circuit breaker that we've been discussing. And at paragraph 5 of that meeting, of those meeting minutes, it states that work is being undertaken under the auspices of you, the chief economist. Now, in your witness statement, page 15, paragraph 56, if I can just pull that up, you explain, while we're waiting, in short form, that you do not know what that work was being what work that was or what was being referred to there. Is that right?
No, I mean, I know what work we were doing in the Treasury on the economic analysis. What I didn't know is what the author who drafted that minute intended by it. I wasn't at the meeting. It wasn't checked with us. I think it was probably, no doubt they were busy and under stress, and perhaps it's a loosely drafted phrase. What we were doing in the Treasury, as I've described to you and as the statement says, is a huge amount of analysis on what the economic impacts of the virus were, and we were sharing that with ministers. I suspect this is possibly just a phrase that was drafted that perhaps wasn't as accurate as it could have been.
Could it also be attributable, though, to the lack of communication as between, for example, SAGE and the Treasury on these points? As I say, that lack of synthesis between the two. You're reporting into, as you say, ministers, but there's very limited interaction between the epidemiologists and other scientific committees, SPIMO, SAGE and the like, and then the Treasury.
I think, I wouldn't interpret this line in the minutes as that. I mean, I'm not an expert on SAGE, obviously, but I think it is right that SAGE focuses on science. I mean, that is its expertise and what it is set up to do. I think it is right that where you have the expertise on the economy, the people with that expertise are advising on the economics. And then I think it is necessary that you have somewhere that brings that all together and synthesises it and informs decision makers as best they can. So, we did have, there was a good relationship between the Treasury and SAGE. In fact, we had an observer from the Treasury at SAGE to make sure that there were not misunderstandings and those sorts of things. But I do think it's right in a sense that, the expertise focuses on what it's expert in, and then it's all brought together and synthesised in a place that is capable of doing that and has the capacity to do that.
And if I can just pick up on the expertise point for a moment, as you say, Treasury and economics, obviously. Also, though, within SAGE, you have SPI-B, the behavioural scientists. You also have the epidemiologists who have expertise actually in pre-pandemic situations, in how behaviour does change in pandemic situations, those sorts of issues. And to bring you back to one of the primary issues that you saw at the Treasury, a challenge, was that inability to accommodate that behavioural change, to understand how that behavioural change might play out when it comes to modelling. Would it not have been of benefit to have had assistance from SPI-MO and the SPI-B or any of those other committees with respect to your modelling, because behaviour was such an integral part of it?
To be clear, we had good relations and worked with behavioural scientists, both SPI-B and, of course, the Behavioural Insights Unit, and we had lots of conversations. I think the challenge was the information there. I don't think the issue was the information was there and we weren't using it. The issue was it was incredibly uncertain, these situations, and so it was just incredibly hard to know. For example, as when the second lockdown happened, how would people respond? Would they respond in a similar way to the first? And actually we saw big changes. But the issue on process, I think, the challenge was the challenge of the circumstance being incredibly difficult to deal with, to understand, to predict, rather than we weren't necessarily talking to or harnessing the expertise that was available in behavioural science. We were using what was available and feeding that into our modelling.
I'm sure that everybody will understand the inherent complexities in dealing with a situation that was evolving, that people had not been in before, and all of those uncertainties. But notwithstanding that, we do see in other areas, such as SAGE and SPI-MO, that modelling is undertaken, even with all of those variables, with those uncertainties. In fact, it's a point of some of the consensus statements, is to deal with those uncertainties. We see probability risks and so on. Is that not something that Treasury could have done to try to assist it when it came to providing advice on NPIs and potential impacts, effectively so that you could design smarter NPIs and not necessarily have to resort to those lockdowns?
We did do a lot of modelling, and we did use the information as far as possible. So we were doing modelling and we were using it. For sure. I mean, on smarter MPIs, yes, and actually one of the things we did do, and you've seen it in the evidence, is build what's called epi-macro models that bring together the epidemiologists and the macroeconomics as far as they can. And we did use those models and try to, and they have the results and the insights that they bring are very similar to the ones that you're talking about in terms of smarter MPIs, and actually are there a range of restrictions that you could look at, and how do you think about those in terms of their impact on the virus and the impact on the economy?
But for the Treasury, the epi-macro modelling was not a particular success. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't say it was no less a success for the Treasury than it was for anyone else, if you like. We were using very similar techniques. We talked to a lot of academic epi-macro modelers, and actually, if you look at other organisations, they were doing the same. I think epi-macro modelling, was clearly evolving very quickly, and that was very useful through the pandemic, and we learnt a lot about it. Where it was challenging, and challenging for everyone, is in terms of the insights it could provide into very specific decisions about which restrictions and at what time. So we used it, and we used it in the same way others did, and tried to bring what insights we could into our analysis. I mean, I should say at this point, one of the things that we did a lot was talk to people in other countries about what they were doing, and their approach was on the modelling and the analysis, and people would, there was, to make sure that, were we missing things, were there other things that we should be thinking about, and others were taking a very similar approach. So I wouldn't say the epi-macro modelling wasn't a huge success. It sort of, what's a success depends on what you're asking it to do. It gave us some insight. It wasn't a particularly useful tool for, making policy decisions about restrictions.
Indeed, what you say in your statement is that it had limited practical application. They weren't a big part of advice to ministers, essentially, as a consequence. What were they replaced by?
What do you mean?
Well, as I understand it, you ceased using those epi-macro models, and what filled that gap? You said they had some utility.
I can't recall actually if we sort of ceased using them. I wouldn't look at that. What we had was that we had a suite of models that we used, and we used those models throughout the pandemic in different ways for different things, as was sort of useful. And we also had the sort of data and analysis that we were using, and we brought those together and we used them through. So it would be wrong to sort of think, well, we developed an epi-macro model, we tried it, it didn't work, we threw it away. That wasn't the sort of approach that we took. We were all the time evolving what was useful in the modelling capability, and depending on what the specific question is that you're trying to answer, in some areas a model might be useful, in other areas it might not be. In some areas, actually, better to look at the evidence and analysis on the ground. And we were doing a combination of things throughout and adapting. Basically, I mean, as you said, huge uncertainty. We were bringing together what was available and what we could usefully use, and maximising the information that we could bring to any specific question or the questions overall.
The stenographer is struggling.
Sorry.
Both of you.
If I can, that's my fault. Let's both try and slow down.
Sorry, yes.
Not at all. I'm going to move now to a different type of model, if I may, very briefly. That's the toy model. So a toy model was developed in the later stages of 2020, going into 2021, and indeed provided to the Treasury amongst other departments. Now, we can just deal with what a toy model is briefly. It's a very basic model. You can play around with the assumptions and as a consequence, run different scenarios. Is that a very high-level overview of a toy model?
Yes, it's a simplified model.
Exactly. Now, there were concerns about the use of the Treasury's engagement with that toy model. If I can just pull up INQ 000196031, this is an email chain that involves Angela McLean, so the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Ministry of Defence, but also the Deputy GCSA at the time, Philip Duffy and Ben Warner, who we'll be hearing from later. If we can just go over the page, please, to page 2. And what we see here is the email from Dame Angela McLean, and it explains that she has concerns with how HMT has been utilising the toy model. She explains that HMT have changed the model after she had quality assured it. She doesn't know how that happened. Obviously, this is all dealing with epidemiological modelling, so something that's not strictly, as you would say, within the expertise of Treasury in the initial instance. She makes it plain that any modelling that comes out of Treasury as a consequence has no endorsement from her, they're on their own. And she continues to say that there is an inability previously to spot egregious errors in other things that they've been sent. I do not have any confidence in their ability to hack a simple, sensible model. Were you involved at any point within the toy model?
I wasn't, I'm afraid.
Do you have any understanding, or were you aware of the issues that were being discussed in relation to the Treasury's use of the toy model?
Not really. I understand that the toy model was this was referred to as a sort of simplified epidemiological model that I think the Joint Biosecurity Centre in the Cabinet Office constructed with input from other departments, in particular from SPI-M. And so I was aware it was happening. I think Treasury modellers, were involved, and as you can see here, it wasn't economic in nature, so I don't, I'm afraid, have any first-hand knowledge of it. On the email exchange, I also, I saw this email, and I did speak to Ben Warner, I think, after it, but that was much more broadly just to talk about actually the importance of making sure that this modelling work fed into the COVID task force at the time, who were the people responsible for bringing it all together. But I'm afraid on the details of what's being referred to here, I simply don't know.
No. Thank you. And if I can turn to some of the various policies, I appreciate that you are not in charge of policy, but you have some understanding owing to your previous role and indeed your role as a chief economist generally. But if I may touch upon the summer of 2020, again, you will be aware that there were criticisms that the Treasury was suffering from optimism bias at that point. Is that something that you saw within your role at the Treasury at that time? Was there a belief that we were coming through the pandemic, moving through, getting ahead of the virus?
I don't think the Treasury had optimism bias. I would say. I mean, maybe I would say that. Indeed, if anything, the Treasury is normally accused of the opposite. But in this particular time, I mean, what was going on at the time, I think, was the government. Restrictions were being lifted because the outlook looked a bit better. So I think across the piece, as restrictions were being lifted, and perhaps people did want to sort of look forward and feel this was behind them. But I don't think the Treasury it certainly didn't take at any point a particularly different view on the epidemiology than the epidemiologists would have done. I mean, we were getting our information about the virus and its progress and its outlook from the experts on SAGE and through that process. So I don't think we had a specific, we certainly didn't have a different view of the epidemiology.
This was at the time when the Eat Out to Help Out policy was introduced, so July, August of 2020. Who and at what level was that policy being driven forwards by?
So overall, I would say the concern at that time on the economic side was around as the economy was coming, we'd had this period of restrictions with very large impact on activity in the economy and on unemployment. And there was a concern, and the economic analysis sort of showed this, that there was a risk that if you have long periods of, for example, inactivity, it can have very bad impact on your employment in future, on your life chances. And we were very conscious of the fact that the desire was to make the economic costs, if you like, of COVID as short-lived as possible, and to bring back activity once the economy was reopened because of the path of the virus. So the concern was around the risks to the economy from lower levels of, for example, consumption, because the UK is a very consumption-heavy economy compared to others, but lower levels of economic activity and the impact that would have had on employment. And as I say, the understanding that periods of employment, in a sense, periods of inactivity, the longer they go on, the bigger impacts they can have. And in particular, we know that the distributional impacts are much greater for people who are at lower ends of the income distribution or people who are on lower skills. And so we were focused on and thinking about the impact on the level of economic activity and jobs. And so the Treasury developed and produced I think was called the Plan for Jobs, which is a range of policy interventions, all of which were about trying to support the economy through this quite difficult period as it reopened, knowing that, you know, businesses would have been under distress, that people's jobs were at risk and the like. And so that was the plan. The Eat Out to Help Out was one part of that package, but that was the background. So there was a you know, a desire in the government actually to sort of move forward on you know, to provide support to the economy as it came out of this period of having quite high levels of restrictions.
So was this being driven by ministers or within the Treasury itself in terms of officials?
Well, I mean, policy decisions are ultimately always for ministers. The economic analysis we were producing was very clear that there were severe economic risks to this period and that the economy was suffering quite greatly in this period. And ministers obviously wanted to know in what ways they could support the economy through what was a really challenging period for, like I say, for employers, businesses and the like.
Now, the position is that neither Sir Patrick Vallance, the CSA, or Sir Chris Whitty, the CMO, or indeed their deputies, were consulted in relation to Eat Out to Help Out. Do you know if any scientist was consulted in relation to Eat Out to Help Out?
I don't, I'm afraid. I wasn't heavily, you know, the process by which the Eat Out to Help Out policy was put together, I understand utilised the sort of architecture we use for budget processes. But you know, I was involved in the sort of economic evidence that fed into this sort of identification of the challenge and our particular concerns about, for example, hospitality. I don't know the details of the clearance process.
Now, you are somebody that was also speaking almost daily on occasion to the CMO and the CSA. Mm-hmm. Did you not ever raise it with them?
Yeah, I think daily, I understand where that comes from the Institute for Government Report. I'm not sure. I mean, early on in the pandemic, we spoke very, very regularly, particularly in those early weeks in March and April when it was the uncertainties were higher. I did speak to Patrick and Chris regularly when it was useful to do so. I don't know if I did during this period. But the decisions about how policy is developed and, you know, who is involved in it and all of that were not decisions that, you know, I would be, you know, they were not decisions for me. And like I say, we use the architecture we use for when we develop any other fiscal event for the plan for jobs overall. So I don't know who was sort of involved in each component.
You dealt with the economic aspects. Do you know if the risk of potentially increasing infections was considered at all?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. The policy was conceived in the context that you know, it was safe to lift restrictions and activity could return.
Now, with regard to that policy, if I can just call up INQ 000235019 very briefly. We see that there were two predominant aims to it. You can see that at the very top here. The first was to support the economic recovery by stimulating consumption in the hospitality sector. And the second is really looking at behavioural change to incentivise consumers to return to the hospitality industry, consume sit-down meals out by reassuring people it is once again safe to consume and altering social behaviours that have become entrenched. Essentially, to encourage levels of contact that had previously been restricted considerably. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that the objectives were to, as I say, support economic recovery and also to limit what was often called the scarring effect of, you know, what would be the long-term impact of the virus and of the measures taken to control it. Yeah.
Now, towards the end of the scheme, there was feedback that it was causing problems. Were you aware of that feedback?
I wasn't, no. I wasn't responsible for the policy side of the scheme.
And just two other areas, and briefly in relation to the involvement of the Treasury and financial support. The first relates to self-isolation payments for those in low-paid employment or unstable employment, the gig economy, 0 hours contracts. And we've heard evidence from Professor Yardley, indeed from Lee Kane, that it's important that financial assistance was provided to individuals to allow them, to enable them to be able to self-isolate. But we've heard that throughout, Treasury pushed back and refused to extend that finance, aside from some final payments that were made in September of 2020, but it continued to be a problem regardless. Were you involved in any modelling or any analysis in relation to how much that would cost and whether there was any cost-benefit analysis?
No, I wasn't. I mean, I was aware that of the sort of policy issue in discussion. The relevant policy team, which would have been in the public services part of the Treasury or the welfare part of the Treasury, would have been handling that issue and would have undertaken whatever analysis was necessary. It wouldn't, if you like, have been macroeconomic in nature.
Do you know if it was a decision taken out of principle or whether those impacts and analysis was actually undertaken?
I don't know. I would expect that analysis, that they would have, that the decision would have been taken on the basis of an understanding of the issue and analysis, but I'm afraid I can't add any detail.
You may not be able to help me with this next one then, because it really falls into the same type of category, but if I can just ask the question. Payments for care workers, significant issue being potential transmission as a consequence of care workers working in more than one care home or establishment, as a consequence of the fragility of the sector, in short. Again, HMT were approached with proposals to allow for those individuals to be compensated for not being able to move between different care homes, but HMT refused to expand or extend any financial provision in that respect. Do you know anything about that decision?
I'm afraid not. Again, the relevant policy team would have been working with the Department of Health and Social Care and would have been considering that.
Thank you. Just turning then, if I may, to that whole period, from the Eat Out to Help Out the summer and then into the autumn when some of these policy decisions were being discussed, were you aware that the Chancellor was being referred to as Dr. Death in some quarters across government?
I wasn't, no.
Were you aware that he'd been perceived to have an anti-lockdown, anti-restriction approach, feeding any of those sorts of comments?
I wasn't. We were providing advice and information to him. He will have been aware of the economic consequences of these decisions.
And then finally, if I can just turn to one last topic, and that's in relation to the potential integration of, and we've discussed it to some extent, science alongside economics, health, social impact material. If I can just pull up an email, please. It's an email from you. It follows on from a 5th of June 2020 seminar on those issues. It's INQ 000235261. And what we see here, as I say, it's an email from you. It's to some extent a readout of what's taken place at that earlier meeting. It's a meeting with Ben Warner, chairing it at number 10. You explain that you're not sure if anything will come of it. We continue onwards. Discussion would have felt very familiar. Economists all did a very clear pitch on smarter MPIs being able to deliver the same level of virus control at a lower economic cost. You refer to a paper. But the part that I'm interested in is the next section, which states, there was a general conclusion by economists that the economics is not being considered enough. And indeed, you'll be aware that the Chancellor at the time and subsequently has expressed that opinion. And for a desire for a place to bring this together. So this is quite early on in the pandemic. We're talking about the 5th of June of 2020. 3 options were proposed at that time. So there's an effort to synthesise some of this material. 1 is an economic sage. 2 is a single model, effectively presumably drawing together the science, the epidemiology, the health and the economics all into one model, or 3, something more informal. The very first thing you say is that the economists obviously killed the single model. Why was that obvious?
I think it was obvious because if you imagine attempting to construct a single model that could solve, if you like, bring together all of the issues that the government had to decide over, so, considering health, both the sort of epidemiology and the virus, but also actually the wider health impacts if you then think about adding in economics, adding in social, distributional issues, but if you were to sort of imagine this model also had to have a distributional feature where you were looking across, gender, ethnicity, income groups. If you were then to add in educational impacts, if you were then to add in impacts on other public services, I think you can quite quickly see that there's no single model that could, in a sense, solve. I mean, it'd be wonderful if you could just have a model and solve for what the government's policy response should be. But I think if you think about the reality of that, one single model could never do that. What you can do with modelling is look at different parts and aspects of it. So that will be why.
Okay. And in relation to the economic stage, that found slightly greater favour. And then it's spoken about in terms that Ben Warner would follow up. Ideally, you'd dock that into the existing structures and process and use it to get greater weight on economic arguments in number 10 thinking. Yeah. There was no real follow-up, was there, in relation to this? Nothing came of this discussion in terms of pulling together an economic sage or anything of that nature. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, nothing came from this specific discussion. I do remember also having quite some discussions with, for example, Patrick Vallance about the way we could do this on the back of some conversations he'd had. And we did set up a sort of partnership with the Royal Economic Society and use that to get a wide range actually of economic input, which was incredibly useful into the process. Again, not quite like SAGE in terms of, it wasn't meeting weekly with commission papers and the like. But you're right, in response to this particular email, I think at the time we didn't follow up by effectively establishing an economic SAGE or similar.
Indeed, you'll have also seen that it's been suggested that the Treasury itself shut down that idea of an economic SAGE model, that senior officials within the Treasury vetoed proposals from other departments to establish a cross-department group to discuss the economic impacts. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't really I'm not aware of there being a specific proposal that was in a sense shut down. What we were very keen to do is make sure that the economic analysis and evidence and arguments were feeding into the Cabinet Office process and that they were considered as part of that. And, so we thought the right answer to this was that you needed a central government place that was bringing together all of these incredibly, different arguments and putting them, bringing them together. And we thought that was, incredibly important. And of course, how that was done evolved through the pandemic. But it was absolutely essential that there was a place that could bring all of this together.
And is it your view, therefore, that place ought to be the Cabinet Office as opposed to either an economic SAGE or a body that sits above the various different committees to synthesise that advice?
I don't think it would be for an economic SAGE to bring together all the different arguments in the same way that I don't think SAGE as it is should consider that should be focused on science. If you were to set up an economic SAGE, I would think you would very much want it to focus on economics, and that's where you could ask it, could consider some of these issues around modelling. I wouldn't suggest you had a committee of economists deciding or solely being the people thinking about the other issues, education, for example, health. I don't think it's for economists. So I do think it's very much a case that you need the experts to focus on their expert areas and that then to be fed into and for them to talk to each other and learn from each other. But, that you have a place where it all comes together. That could be the Cabinet Office. I mean, that is what the Cabinet Office is for, and I think that's right. Whether within the Cabinet Office you would want to, change it, have different structures. We've done it before. There's things like the National Security Council, and actually in the financial crisis we had, I think it was called the National Economic Council. So those sorts of issues. But I think that is the role of the Cabinet Office. I think that's and that makes sense. An economic SAGE, I think if you could certainly have one and set it up. I would think its scope should be limited to economics.
Thank you, my lady. Those are all the questions I have. There is one question, as I understand it, from the long COVID groups.
Mr. Metzer.
Thank you, my lady. Just one topic, please, Ms. Lombardelli, on behalf of the long COVID groups. You said this morning that briefings were shared with the Chancellor to ensure that he was fully informed. Was the Chancellor formally briefed on the economic impact of large numbers of people suffering from disabling long-term impacts of long COVID?
once we became once, if you like, the long COVID, the health community had become aware of long COVID, that would obviously, those information would have been shared with the Treasury, and we would have reflected it in our evidence and analysis alongside the other long-term impacts that we were very concerned about across the board. But he would have been aware. We wouldn't have done. It's a health issue in and of itself. We wouldn't have estimated, if you like, a specific economic cost for it. But we were thinking about, and we were doing what we could to bring evidence and analysis on the long-term impacts across the board, including, of course, health impacts like long COVID.
Are you able to assist as to when that was?
I can't recall, I'm afraid. And I don't think there would have been a specific point when he would have received a specific piece of evidence that was a specific piece of analysis that was, long COVID, the impact is X. What we would have done is taken the evidence and analysis about all the long-term effects, and that would have included long COVID.
Do you agree, though, that the disabling impact of long COVID would have had an economic effect?
The impact, all the long-term effects, if you like, would have had a range of impacts, health, but also on the economy in some cases. I mean, there will be an economic effect, obviously, for people who are suffering from long COVID in terms of their labour market activity and the like.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Ms Lombardy. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer. Thank you very much indeed, Miss Lombardy. Sorry. Just trying to pronounce your name, maybe cough. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you.
Right, I think we'll break now, partly so I can cough quietly, well, not quietly. I shall return at midday.
All rise.
Mr. Keating.
Lady, may I call Stuart Glassborough, please?
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Do sit down, thank you. Could you give the inquiry your full name, please?
Stuart Richard Glassborough.
Mr. Glassborough, thank you so much for attending today. Thank you for assisting the inquiry with its investigations. A few things just by way of preamble. First of all, both of us need to keep our voices up. Secondly, pace. If we could just monitor our pace, because there's a record being kept of what you and I say. And from time to time, I may ask you to pause just to control the flow of information, if that's okay. And lastly, if any of my questions are unclear, do please ask me to rephrase them, because I'm sure the fault would be with me. Your statements, you provide a statement to the inquiry dated the 11th of October of this year, runs to 35 pages with 50 exhibits. We can see it in front of us, and you have signed that at the back, confirming that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've had the chance to refresh your memory in relation to the statements and other documents as well before coming in today.
Yes.
And your evidence covers the time that you were the Deputy Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister in Number 2's private office. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
A bit of a mouthful, but you were Number 2 to Sir Martin Reynolds.
To Martin, yes.
Yes. And today we want to explore with you really to understand a system in which economic information and analysis and advice was provided and fed through you or other means to the Prime Minister and core decision makers, its evolution during that period, and whether there was any issues with its provision and incorporation. And lastly, and importantly, whether there was any lessons that we, the inquiry, can learn in relation to that. So first area, an overview of your role. You've been a civil servant for over 20 years and still are, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Initially working DWP and then thereafter in the Treasury. And for 3 years, 2019 to May 2022, you were on secondment to Number 10 as the Deputy Principal Private Secretary, as we just heard.
Correct.
And then you returned back to the Treasury and you continue to be there to this day.
Yes.
In relation to how private office works and the role of a principal or deputy principal private secretary, we've heard evidence about that, so I'm going to take it very briefly. But is it fair to say it's a key liaison role?
It does play a liaison role. The private office, I think you did hear about this last week, is
Yes.
that small team, providing direct administrative support for the PM as he discharges his role, arranging meetings,
Yes.
relaying commissions or readouts or decisions from the Prime Minister, obviously to the much bigger unit that is the Cabinet Office and all the other departments in government as well. So it's a sort of small administrative team working around the Prime Minister.
The team's a conduit. And in relation to what you mentioned in your statement, it facilitates joined-up decision-making. You say this. It facilitates coordinated joined-up decision-making and to synthesise, track and drive progress on the Prime Minister's priorities across central government. Is that a fair summary?
I think, yes, it is, obviously working closely with the political team and sort of colleagues in the Cabinet Office as well, but yes.
And that phrase, synthesise, is being used already this morning, and it touches upon your statement, and we'll return to it, about how information is funnelled through into number 10 and how that is then presented, synthesised to the Prime Minister. And as your role as Deputy PPS to Sir Martin, you oversaw domestic policy issues, and Imran Shafi, who we've heard evidence from, he was one of the private secretaries who worked alongside, underneath you. You were his manager, isn't that correct?
Correct.
At multiple meetings, the pandemic consumed your working life over the period of time you were in number 10. I think that's fair to say and to recognise. And you were involved in multiple meetings and multiple types of meetings. What I wish to draw out are the meetings on an economic front that you were involved in, or key meetings. And from your statement, we can draw out this, that there was 11 different types of meetings, but the core ones, is it not, were the PM's morning meetings, the 9:15s. And you were involved with HMT, Her Majesty's Treasury, and economy meetings, such as bilateral meetings with the Chancellor. And in relation to those, you mentioned that they were on a weekly, fortnightly cycle. Is that correct?
Yeah, the PM's bilateral meetings
Yes.
with the Chancellor, yes.
Thank you. So bilateral means Chancellor and Prime Minister.
And the supporting teams.
Of course. Data dashboard meetings, which we've heard about generally. Economy dashboard meetings, which we're going to touch upon in a few moments. And in addition, there was regular meetings between you and senior HMT officials. You were the link person between HMT and number 10. Before turning to that economic funneling of information and to synthesise that information, I want to touch upon the initial response of the UK government. And we've heard a lot of evidence about that already, so it's going to be quite short. But you were a person who was there in person, actually, during this time, and you've touched upon it in your statement. In relation to the initial response of number 10 in January up until late February, your evidence distills to this, does it not? Everyone was broadly carrying on business as usual. We were unaware of the likely scale and impact of the pandemic and therefore treated as one of the many issues crossing the PM's desk up until late February 2020. Is that a fair representation of the evidence in your statement?
Yes.
And you add this, and perhaps we could bring this up, it's page 17, paragraph 62A, please. Last 3 lines. To the best of my knowledge, we in private office and the number 10 machine more generally were not advised of the likely scale of the pandemic and its impacts. And this is at late February. Just reflecting upon that, and there's a caveat there, to the best of your knowledge. But is that an accurate statement, that number 10 machine was not advised of the likely scale of the pandemic and its impacts?
I think the point that I'm looking to make here is that in this initial period, you mentioned sort of January and February, as you said, COVID was one of the issues the Prime Minister was engaging with,
Yes.
Alongside lots of others, including the sort of development of the budget that the Chancellor was to deliver on the 11th of March, and High Speed 2 and 5G, and I think some of the things that other witnesses mentioned last week. And at that time, in this time, while I think there is, there's all the information and analysis that's being discussed in the COBRA forums and coming in from SAGE at this time, and what I don't recall hearing was sort of lots of representations that the sort of Prime Minister's diary should be completely cleared of everything else and that he should be solely focused on COVID in this phase, as opposed to it being, as you said, one of those issues amongst many. Now, that might sound a bit odd in hindsight now, but I think that was the felt experience at the time.
So just pausing there, in relation to focus, the focus was elsewhere. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I think there was significant focus on COVID. It was an issue, and there was data coming in, and the Prime Minister was briefed on it in a way I think you've heard about from last week from other witnesses. But there was lots of other issues as well. I mean, genuinely substantive issues on their own terms.
Was it a case from an economic point of view, and that was your liaison with the Prime Minister, was that he, at that stage, up until mid-February, was more concerned about the economic effect of an overreaction to COVID?
I don't know if I would characterise it, his view like that, or I mean, I don't have a completely clear view of what might have been in his mind then. But I think the idea that one would not want to overreact was something that was. I mean, I think I do recall that phrase, and I think he's reflecting some of the advice he received. For example, I think the CCS advice on the 28th of February, which I think again you've looked at a bit,
yes,
refers to sort of the need to balance, the desire to take precautionary measures, but while not overreacting. So in that, I mean, I think I recall him in a sense echoing the advice he received.
Was a little bit more than that. Bear in mind, before events unfolded in Lombardy, he was referring to, well, is this like swine flu? It's not that serious. There's a danger of overreacting.
I mean, I don't recall him saying that.
Not in your daily interactions with him. That's not something which came up.
No.
You describe in your evidence that the second phase in the response at number 10 is when the scale of the problem in northern Italy became clear and the intensity of work stepped up in late February. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then we fast forward to a change in strategy on the 13th of March, where you were present at a significant meeting with Mr. Cummings, Mr. Warner, Mr. Shafi, and Ms. McNamara on the evening of the 13th of March. And you recall that, don't you?
Yes.
And this followed on, as you say, from the SAGE meeting that day. And how would you describe the mood in the room amongst this collection of civil servants and advisors?
Well, I think it was a very serious discussion because this was sort of a moment where I think Ben Warner was reporting back from the SAGE discussion, and the latest data from that and what that might mean. And in parallel, Helen McNamara, as you heard from last week, I think sort of relayed, her new latest understanding of the sort of readiness of, the government's wider plans for dealing with the pandemic. And you got both of those things being part of that same discussion, which made it a pretty serious discussion.
Helen McNamara funneling in her knowledge, inquiries into Civil Contingency Secretariat, Department of Health plans.
From the Cabinet Office, yeah,
yes,
exactly. Ben
Ben Warner feeding in his view and assessment of the SAGE meeting and the modelling.
Yeah, so you've got both those issues
yes.
sort of coming, as it happens, coming together in one discussion that evening.
And was this a case of civil servants and political advisors really taking over a view of what the strategic direction should have been?
Well, the nature of that discussion was to talk through the two issues that we've just mentioned, in particular the sort of the latest data from SAGE and what that might imply for, I think, what's now been described as Plan A
yes.
for managing the virus, with I think an awareness amongst the group of people that there may be a case for pivoting to a different plan in order to protect the NHS, something more
yes.
closer to suppression rather than mitigation to achieve that, and also that the challenge may be more immediate than perhaps been appreciated by some people. But while this is, it felt like at the time, and talking to you now, it feels like a very significant discussion. It is also just sort of some of the Prime Minister's team and someone from the Cabinet Office, in effect, preparing a meeting or meetings for that weekend, and that was what happened. Is that the output from those discussions was for us to convene meetings to prepare to brief the Prime Minister, and for him to engage or hear from the scientists directly, meet some of his ministerial colleagues, and those were the meetings that took place on the Saturday and Sunday. So the scale of the issues is significant, but the in a sense it doesn't feel like an unusual process to me.
Don't want to cut you short, but our long answers, and we perhaps try to condense them a little bit more to assist our stenographer. In relation to, you use the phrase that pivoting in relation to the plan, perhaps an understatement, the strategy was jettisoned, was it not, when you went for the meeting with the Prime Minister on the 14th of March, which you touch upon your statement, that the view was that there was a real need for an immediate lockdown. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure there were. I'm not sure, my recollection is not that there was the realisation or the view that we need an immediate lockdown. As I say, I think the two key points on the data, or what might be implied by the data in those discussions on the Saturday or the Prime Minister's meetings, related to the need to take more significant measures than had been hitherto imagined, and possibly to move quicker than had been envisaged.
Just pause there.
And I think
just pause there. There's a follow-up question will hopefully assist you. Two questions which flow from this, and then I'm going to move on to our main topic. Was there an agreement or acknowledgement at that meeting on the 14th of March that there would be a need for a lockdown? Well,
I think the readout from that meeting says that it was agreed that it's the right time to implement measures sooner than had been envisaged. And then the summary, the readout from the follow-up meeting on the 15th was that that measures should be brought to COBRA, the actual official decision-making forum, that meeting that happened on the Monday, to implement advisory measures on working from home, staying at home, not going to pubs and restaurants, i.e. the sorts of things that the Prime Minister then announced on the 16th. So sort of looking back at the records, from my recollection, the discussions that weekend played into the measures that the Prime Minister announced on the 16th, which at the time felt very significant interventions. Is not. Yes. I can't think of any other time in recent history a Prime Minister has announced those sorts of measures.
Supposing that...
Okay.
Was there, from what the short answer is, well, no, there wasn't a discussion regarding a lockdown. There was a discussion regarding an agreement regarding more restrictions, more NPIs. Was that the position?
Well, I think a significant ramping up of the NPIs. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that from after the event, we have quite a strong concept of lockdown, what exactly that entails, right. The different elements of that is sort of embodied in the 23rd of March. From my recollection, I don't recall, certainly not, widespread understanding of that being the thing that ought to happen, or we ought to get there by a certain date. I more recall discussions happening in real time that led to the sort of announcements on the 16th of March, the closing of schools further later that week, the further restrictions, I think, that were announced on the Friday, which all then...
Let him finish.
Forgive me.
I think it won't be quick and long one, Mr. Keating.
But then the realisation the following weekend, or the advice the following weekend, that there's a need to go further, and hence what we now know as a lockdown being implemented on the 23rd.
So it was a case more of a rolling measures of NPIs, which then evolved into a lockdown.
Yes, in the light of the data being updated and our increasing awareness of the situation.
Last question on this. Was it a case from the 14th of March that the Prime Minister expressed that there was a need to play for time before imposing greater restrictions, such as a lockdown?
No, I don't recall that.
No recollection.
No.
I'm going to move on to the economic aspect, which is the central aspect of your evidence today. You mentioned, and we touched upon already, that HMT, Her Majesty's Treasury, was a core part of your role. And again, obvious, HMT having a central role in government, really, because of the financial aspect. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you mentioned at paragraph 31 of your statement is that one aspect of your role is to crystallise the options for the Chancellor and the PM in the round, having regard to the choices, priorities and the trade-offs inherent in economic and fiscal policy. And you were the lead between, as we discussed already, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in that respect. Drawing your evidence together on this is that that in that sort of crystallisation of the options role, is it right that you would commission and communicate data, analysis and advice, prepare meetings, and commission advice as necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the Treasury's job to crystallise the options, and as you say, in the round, i.e., looking at the interlinkages or
yes.
the trade-offs between them. I mean, my role, slightly more mundanely, was to sort of help prepare the meetings for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to discuss those. I mean, for example, as would then be decided or announced by the Chancellor at budgets or spending reviews in normal times.
But in any event, you were a key conduit between Number 10 and HMT.
Yes.
In terms of what economic information the Prime Minister was receiving via HMT and from other sources coming in at times through you. You touch upon this at paragraph 36. Perhaps you could bring that up. I sought to ensure the Prime Minister had the latest economic and financial information received from HMT, appraisal of relevant economic analysis pertaining to specific options for managing the pandemic. And he was able to engage the Chancellor in decision-making on economic and fiscal policy so that he was informed to respond to the Chancellor. How was that done? How did you ensure that he had that information?
Well, I'll perhaps work through the
yes.
three elements briefly to give a sense of this. So I think the first part of the Chancellor's role in providing economic advice to the Prime Minister, obviously supported by the Treasury, is point A here, giving a description of the latest economic situation, financial information. During the pandemic, I instigated sort of a regular series of economy dashboard meetings, which for the Chief Economic Advisor, I think you heard from earlier, and colleagues in the Cabinet Office, and on occasion for other departments to present to the Prime Minister that sort of picture. Building on, that we instigated that because of the sheer scale and pace of the issues that were evolving at that time, but it builds on regular weekly briefings, sure. Market updates that are coming through by email that I would then, put in the PM's box as relevant. So there's a sort of established way of doing that we built on. On the second, sorry, do you want to come in on that?
Would you like, because it's one of the topics I was going to explore, why don't we deal with it sequentially? Because there's a section on economic dashboards.
Okay.
While we're talking about it, let's deal with it. Because you mentioned at paragraph 40 of your statement that you sought to systemise the economic briefing for the Prime Minister, and you established a series of economic dashboard meetings which ran from June 2020. And these took place roughly every 3 or 4 weeks in sequence, and that was in parallel to the reporting of information that was available. Yeah. Why did you feel the need to systemise the economic briefing in June 2020?
Well, as I say, I think there's an established practice for the Chancellor. There's various means by which the Chancellor or the Treasury on his behalf provide this sort of analysis to the Prime Minister in normal times, like directly in meetings or bilateral meetings that they might have together, or through sort of written briefing. But the thought here is just the scale of the issues and impacts from the virus or the measures taken to manage the virus meant, and the speed at which they were sometimes moving, I think made Treasury colleagues and I think that it was worth having. You said 3 to 4 weeks. I think there were initially weekly meetings actually, for much of, but for 2020, I think they were pretty much weekly meetings, to take the Prime Minister through the latest on employment, inflation, how different sectors are doing, different regions are doing, consumer behaviour, business behaviour. This all sounds quite dry, but it is the data that relates to people's lives and livelihoods.
Well, we can look at one of those for an illustration so that people know what you're talking about. You said they were weekly. I was quoting you 3 to 4 times a week, but I'm quite happy for that clarification. In terms of attendees, and we'll look at one in a moment, those who are present at these meetings, is it right it was the Chief Economic Advisor from HMT, other senior officials, and on occasion would the CMO or the CSA be at any of these meetings?
For the most part, the Cabinet Office sort of brought these together. So senior official in the Cabinet Office with the Chief Economic Advisor. On occasion, I think maybe some officials from other departments. If some of the data related to sort of businesses, you might have someone from the business department would be present as well. And then I think CMO or CSA did attend some of these meetings as well.
Well, let's look at one. So it's a dashboard which was prepared to show at the meeting. That's INQ 000281288, please. This is one of your exhibits, and it's dashboard 14. So we're looking at this as an illustration of one type of way economic information was fed through to the Prime Minister. And if we could turn to page 2, please. And this is just a snapshot of what would be referred to retail sales, consumer and business confidence, and the labour market. And let's look at page 3 just for a moment. The graphs perhaps speak for itself. And page 4. At this stage, we're 29th of October, we have Eat Out and Mobility. And we see there on the graph, the blue line, that there was, for the UK average, that there was a significant increase in eating out at that stage as a result of that scheme. Is that correct?
I think that's what it shows, yes.
Yes. And perhaps we could deal with, whilst we're dealing with information, polls and deal with Eat Out to help out, and your knowledge of it from the number 10 perspective. We've heard some evidence already this morning from Ms. Lombardali from the HMT perspective. Eat Out to help out. Would you agree a significant economic measure that summer?
I think it was a reasonably significant economic measure. It was part of the summer economic plan the Chancellor announced on the 8th of July, I think, and one measure amongst several, including I think it's £9 billion job retention scheme and a £14 billion business rates support, £9 billion on grants, sort of £3 billion cut in stamp duty. And this measure was one part of that package. I think actually the cost of it was only a few hundred million. So from the sort of purely sort of fiscal scale, it wasn't, I think it was actually only a few percentage points, as it were, of the overall economic package that the Chancellor did announce at that time. But obviously it was a significant measure.
Yes, significant measure, significant in terms of trying to change human behaviour and to get consumers out into society. Is that a fair summary?
I think it is. I mean, I recall a bit from the time, but I've sort of looked at some of the documents since in preparing for this that I think that the Treasury and the Chancellor, sought to design the scheme to operate within the wider COVID framework in place at the time, or the guidelines that had been developed and announced. And I think at the 23rd of June, the Cabinet decided to open, hospitality as part of a wider approach of incorporating sort of COVID secure, regime, COVID secure sort of way of living, with use of table service, restrictions on group size, maintaining safe distance in the space. And I think that was, the wider regime for managing the virus. And then this economic policy was designed, as I understand it, reading the Treasury material now, but it was designed to sort of fit in within that.
So what I'd like you to do is putting aside the Treasury perspective at the moment, is from your perspective, number 10, about your knowledge of this scheme and how it evolved. It probably flows from your answer already. This was something which was, am I right in understanding, was driven by HMT and the Chancellor as a scheme. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in terms of its formulation, when did you, at number 10, as that sort of conduit with the Treasury, when did you become aware of this scheme was about to launch?
I think it was in a meeting on the 2nd of July when the Chancellor took the Prime Minister through the overall summer economic plan that we've mentioned. I mean, at some point in late May, the Chancellor done a very, very high-level overview of his sort of early thinking, where he'd mentioned the idea of sort of targeted tax cuts or a subsidy scheme, a sort of that level of detail, but something that looks like Eat Out to Help Out was something I heard about on the 2nd of July.
Yes. And was there no awareness, or did there become an awareness at number 10 that there was no scientific analysis of the impact this scheme would have on the virus?
I don't recall whether that was discussed in that meeting or not.
And thereafter, we had this period from July until the launch of the scheme in August. Was there any knowledge in that intervening period of the absence of scientific evidence?
I think I and others in number 10 did become aware that as you say, there hadn't been direct CMO, CSA, SAGE analysis or advice on this policy. So we did come to know that.
When you said before the launch of the scheme in August?
Yes.
And was it a case that a view was taken, well, we're going to persist with the scheme in any event?
Well, I don't. I can't speak on behalf of all people who would have had an interest in this. I don't recall significant sort of representations being made to sort of, in some sense, revisit the policy. That's not to say that some people didn't have views or one way or another at that time. But in the sort of wider context was, as I say, this was one measure in some purely sort of fiscal sense, quite a small measure amongst the whole wider economic package. And some awareness that this was a sort of type of scheme that was being implemented in other countries as well.
No more on Eat Out to Help Out. Let's return back to the dashboard and go to page 5, please. I'm going to have look at 2 more pages on this slide and put it to one side. Here again is sort of information which the Prime Minister would see and other key decision makers. We see consumer and business confidence and its negativity during that period. And lastly, we see, if we could turn to page 7, which are, and page 8, please, thank you. In terms of the parts of the economy, the sectors which were presented in this information, we can see it was broken down into sectors which could operate remotely, those which required a physical presence of workers, and those which required a physical presence of consumers. That's how the sectors were divided, is that correct?
Yes.
And one question is this, is that in relation to the economic data which has been funneled through and represented in these dashboards or other dashboards around that time, did it consider the impact on different socio-economic groups or different ethnic groups?
I don't have in my mind the precise content of all of, we had around 40 of these meetings sort of through 2020 and 2021, so I can't recall the precise content. We followed a broad template, but it evolved over time. I think, 2 thoughts. One, in these meetings, these sort of facilitated precisely that discussion. For example, there was quite a lot of discussion at different points about the hospitality sector, the very significant impact of the virus on that sector, and the fact that its workforce is disproportionately young and lower paid from ethnic minority and female, in fact. And that I recall that being the sort of issue that was discussed off the back of this information. I think the second thing I just stress as well is that the purpose of this tool is a sort of the provision of information, contextual data for the Prime Minister, building on. I mean, a lot of this data was in the main COVID dashboard as well.
Yes.
Used in those even more frequent meetings, but this sort of built that out a bit further for the Prime Minister. The policy, the advice on what measures to take to manage the virus, what restrictions to impose, or how and when to lift certain measures as the virus is abating, that was brought together by the Cabinet Office with input from the Treasury on that policy. And my very strong recollection is that those key bits of advice from the Cabinet Office for the Prime Minister for COVID-O, COVID-S meetings, the main committee meetings you've heard about previously, all included sort of equalities information, the impact of the virus and how that actually itself is having disproportionate impacts on, for example, certain ethnic minorities.
So just pausing there.
And I'll just finish the point. Just on the economic, the economic measures of closing or opening certain sectors or taking measures in certain regions might have particular impacts as well. So those policy documents did contain that sort of information.
We're aware of the wider information. I was just asking in relation to economic effect in relation to ethnic groups or socio-economic groups, whether that was presented in a dashboard. Can you assist inquiry, go back over those dashboards, check what the position is, and whether this is a representative dashboard, and then we'll know whether that data comes through, please. Another source of information, economic information for the Prime Minister was the bilateral meetings with the Chancellor. And in relation to those, we've heard a little bit about them. They were meetings which took place in any event. They were a regular feature pre and perhaps post-COVID. But one question is this, in relation to the amount of meetings going on at that time. 09-15 meetings, COVID-S, the Quad, the Cabinet. Why was there a need for these bilateral meetings between the Chancellor and Prime Minister only at that time?
I think the Prime Minister had bilateral meetings with a range of his colleagues. I mean, he does in normal times, and he did in this time. I mean, is a normal feature of government for the Prime Minister to meet specific colleagues to discuss issues in their portfolio. The main items being discussed in these specific meetings was on sort of economic interventions or economic support measures. So I mentioned earlier that the Prime Minister typically in committee meetings would decide what measures to take to respond to the virus, what restrictions to impose, which restrictions to lift. Once sort of that path is set, as it were, at a point in time, there would then be a need for the government to consider what economic measures to take. So, for example, in March 2020, we've locked down, the Treasury bring forward a proposal on furlough to support workers at that time. And the sorts of measures I mentioned earlier in the summer economic plan, the tax measures, stamp duty, etc. And those tax and spend measures, as it were, conditioned on the wider context as set out, as determined by the virus, as determined by other decisions. Those would be the ones that principally the Prime Minister and Chancellor would discuss in their bilateral meetings.
Could I ask one question in relation to that, which is this, where you mentioned that these meetings were in terms largely, if not solely, for support in relation to decisions and strategy which have been agreed, economic support. Was it ever that these meetings were an area where the Chancellor or the Prime Minister would look to review or finalise a strategy such as lockdown?
I think the Prime Minister and the Chancellor did discuss in some of these meetings the question of how to manage the virus, as I imagine the Prime Minister did in his meetings with the Health Secretary and, as relevant to the Education Secretary as well. They weren't the decision-making forums for those decisions. That would be the meetings in well, ultimately Cabinet, but the COVID-O, COVID-S committee meetings with the range of ministers in them. Where they are, in effect, the decision-making meeting is on these economic policy, furlough, scheme for the self-employed, loans, grants, and that is actually, I think, a pretty long-established convention that it may even be enshrined, I think, in the Cabinet manual, that on those sorts of economic policies, which in normal times typically manifest themselves in budgets, but here we were having sort of announcements quite more frequently than that. Those decisions were for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to take together.
Thank you. 4 remaining topics which we're going to cover before lunchtime and one of them is synthesizer, your role, and what does that mean? So you mentioned in your statement that paragraph 51, that you saw your role is to ensure input from across government was synthesised in order to help the Prime Minister to bring together the range of views, sometimes opposing, so that he could make decisions effectively and on an informed basis. And this is a two-way process. In a sense, my role was also involved communicating the Prime Minister's steers and decisions to colleagues. And that's something in a report we're going to touch upon in a moment, is that the synthesization of information. Are you content with what you set out there? Is that an accurate representation of your role, synthesizing information for the Prime Minister?
I think it may not be 100% clear. Just to come back to some of what we were discussing a moment ago. I mean, for my role, sort of as me as an individual being the point person with the Treasury and the Chancellor's team, there would be these sort of data flows that I mentioned earlier, weekly briefing, market data, and the like that I'd have sight of and put to the PM as relevant, as it emerges. On the bit, I would just sort of underscore, linking back to what we said, the bringing together of the analysis and the policy on the management of the pandemic. That's what the Cabinet Office did, taking primarily the health data, the scientific analysis, but also alongside that the economic data on sectors and different bits of the country and the like, and they would bring that together in the papers for the sort of committee meetings. So I wasn't there writing lots of primary documentation for the Prime Minister. There's sort of much larger team in the Cabinet Office was doing that.
Your role, as we discussed already, was a conduit, not as a policy maker or a policy advisor.
Exactly.
I want to turn to the Institute for Government report, which you've seen already. It's entitled "The Treasury During COVID: What Lessons Can Be Learned from the Pandemic," dated April 2023. And again, this is a function of the inquiry, lessons learned. So I'd like your assistance in relation to this. You've seen it already, as I mentioned. Perhaps you could bring that up. It's INQ 000 226 497 at page 1, please. An inquiry also have heard evidence from Alex Thomas, who's from that organisation as well. So there we see the front page and the authors. And it's a 108-page report. We're not going to turn to each and every page, but I'd like you to... It's probably correct to recognise that the report talks and outlines the positive aspects of the Treasury response, includes financial support, engagement with other departments. So it outlines some positive aspects to the Treasury response. And I wish to have your perspective on some of their other observations which maybe fall within that lessons learned category. And one of those is optimism bias. And perhaps we could turn to page 7 in relation to that. I'll bring up the text. I'll read it out to you and ask for your perspective and experience. Bottom of the page. During the summer and autumn of 2020, the Treasury appears to have suffered from an optimism bias that the government's public health advisors did not share. This led the Treasury to not implement some relatively easy improvements to support schemes. Implement the Eat Out to Help Out policy in summer 2020, which was inconsistent with scientific advisors' assessment of the risk of a second wave, and announce very late the extension of the furlough in autumn 2020. The whole text is there. I've read out most, but not all. From your perspective, from being the conduit, is that a description which you could relate to, that there was a degree of optimism bias in summer and autumn 2020?
I mean, obviously, my role is I was in number 10 supporting the Prime Minister. I find it a bit difficult to comment on what is somehow the Treasury's mindset. I mean, I was managing some of the processes that we've been talking about earlier. What I do know is obviously the Treasury had the same scientific analysis and information as everyone else in government at this time, and also, I mean, this obviously relates to a specific period of time. I think there were several discussions, committee meetings, to think about sort of future strategy should the second wave come forward, to contingency plan or prepare for that in the summer, which I know the Treasury team helped prepare and the Chancellor participated in. So I think that's my understanding.
Okay. Information sharing and data is our next point. Let's go to page 6, please. And it should be our second bullet point. It set out what we've discussed already, that the main responsibility for synthesising evidence from across government to inform central decision-making is with the Cabinet Office, but recognises the Treasury is a powerful player at the centre of government and had an important role to play too, and had the ability to advocate for and generate better information sharing. Again, perhaps uncontroversial, but do you agree with that summary of the roles?
I agree with the summary of the roles. I think it says the same thing that we were discussing earlier about the role of the Cabinet Office. And
within that context, if we could pane out and look at the third paragraph, please. It says this: there was a stark contrast in the transparency of economic evidence informing ministers' decisions compared with the scientific evidence. Very little of the social and economic evidence that informed ministers' decisions was published, particularly before 2021. The Treasury shared almost none of its analysis externally, even with trusted experts. This lack of transparency hampered effective synthesis of evidence and thus decision-making, and may have undermined the government's ability to convince the public of the merits of public health restrictions. Pausing there for a moment, do you agree with that analysis that there was a lack of transparency of information from the Treasury?
Well, again, the perspective I can speak from is sort of within number 10, and the Prime Minister, I think, did receive a lot of information in the different ways that we've discussed, and I won't sort of go over them all again, but on the the wider economic situation, the economic analysis relating to sort of the measures taking to manage the virus, and on options and ideas for economic support, and in the different ways and different forums that we've mentioned. I mean, as I read this is a sort of perhaps an observation about transparency, not with number 10, but more widely in government or beyond that. And I mean, from the role I was doing, that's not something I so much have a clear view on.
There's one part which does touch upon you, because it suggests that this lack of transparency hampered the effective synthesis of evidence, which is the Cabinet Office / number 10's role. Do you agree with that observation in this report?
I don't recall having that thought at the time, no.
If we continue down, please.
Well, I suppose it would depend on who had the information, and what do you mean by being transparent? Do you mean telling the public? Do you mean telling other people who need to know, I suppose?
Well, sorry,
well, the synthesis would only be affected if the people who needed the information didn't get it.
Sorry, I don't quite follow the point.
No, well, maybe I'm not.
But it's probably my fault for. Effectively, is this those questions in a report? You were responsible. The Cabinet Office was responsible for the synthesis of the evidence, and the IFG report says, after drawing in observations and soundings from a number of different sources, says that there was a lack of transparency at HMNT, which impacted, they say, number 10's ability to synthesise the evidence. So that's the suggestion. And what do you say to that?
I think the same point I had earlier. I didn't have that that feeling at the time. So in terms of the Treasury's input to the Cabinet Office, I guess that's my answer. I think maybe if your point was that before that, could the Treasury have gone about its business in a different way in terms of what it was gathering or understanding and testing out with other? I mean, I find it a bit. I don't feel that I could sort of comment on how the Treasury goes about its business, as it were, before it then turns to the Cabinet Office or number 10.
No, sorry, my point was, perhaps it's unfair on you, it should go to the authors of the document. But it all depends, if the authors of the document are criticising the transparency of the Treasury, it all depends on what they mean by transparent. Do they mean telling Cabinet Office, or do they mean telling the public?
Yeah.
So that was the...
Yes.
And I tell you what you can probably help on. In normal circumstances, this was obviously a time of national emergency. In normal circumstances, would you expect the advice that the Treasury gives to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Office to synthesise for the Prime Minister to be made public at the time, or at all?
Well, I think, in a sense, that's what budget documents or spending review documents do. In normal times, the government makes, or the Treasury, sets out a whole bundle of decisions on tax and spending and other measures, and sets out the relevant analysis, or indeed sets out the relevant thinking and some of the analysis behind some of those policies with a much fuller sort of exposition on the fiscal and economic impacts, context, in associated documents from the Office of Budget Responsibility, now that that exists to play that independent role. Obviously, what was happening at this time was more frequent decisions in slightly more improvised ways.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Keating.
No, it's all, my lady. Information sharing, just going to continue with this theme a little bit longer. If you could turn to page 7, please. And it suggests that there was a strategic sharing of information by HMT. And I want to ask you about that. It says this: the Treasury shared analysis strategically to support a particular point of view, with the Chancellor feeling he needed to make the economic case as a counter to the health case that the Health Minister was making. This contributed to decision-making being a tug of war in autumn 2020, which led to suboptimal decision-making. So this phraseology regarding a tug of war in autumn 2020, thank you for bringing that up. Was there this binary or separation between science and health on one side and the economy and Treasury on the other side as we left lockdown 1 and emerged into summer and autumn 2020, from your experience at number 10?
Well, I think you thinking in the September period now?
As lockdown eased, restrictions eased, and especially entering September onwards, the circuit breaker thereafter, was there this, as these authors described, a tug of war between Treasury on one side and health on the other side?
I think in September, obviously cases were picking up, and the emergence of the second wave, perhaps foreshadowed by the experience of other European countries. That's the sort of situation we were in, and that was a challenge that was faced, over a couple of months, right up until the final decision to do the second lockdown at the end of October. And so it was discussed sort of multiple times in multiple forums through September, in October, the PM being briefed by the chief scientific advisor and chief medical officer, meeting independent scientists, and I think the meeting you've heard about from other witnesses, and discussing the circuit breaker idea, and then in committee meetings where ultimately he decided, the Prime Minister, not to do the circuit breaker, to do other measures. The rule of 6 at the start of September, toughening the tiers system in October, I think other measures about 22nd of September as well. So discussed in multiple forums, getting information from lots of angles. I think it's known that the scientific advisors were like Sage advocated the circuit breaker, I think, on the 21st, or pushed for it, and I think it's known, or the Chancellor is on record. He did an interview in March 2021 saying he was opposed to a circuit breaker. So I think those positions you probably know them.
Well, giving you the opportunity to give evidence from your perspective as number 10, as somebody who's synthesising information from an economic perspective. And those discussions which were taking place, the last point on this, which is set out at page 61 of the report, says this: interviewees involved in discussions over social restrictions variously described central decision-making for much of 2020 as a bit of a Punch and Judy, quote, enormously chaotic, a tug-of-war, and simply not a proper bringing together of science, public health, and economic considerations. Now, is that a fair assessment from your perspective of those discussions in the autumn of 2020 especially?
I've mentioned that the discussions took place in multiple meetings and ahead of the Prime Minister making decisions at sort of different points in time on the circuit breaker idea, and then ultimately 30th of October on the second lockdown. And there were, well, as we said earlier, debates in those meetings. It's also the case that, you mentioned sort of the whole period of 2020, the ability of the Cabinet Office to sort of have its sort of central, his ability to bring together the analysis from the science and the health and the economic side to inform the advice it was synthesising, it was bringing together, did, as you'd expect from this period, improve over time through 2020 and into 2021. So, that's my main thought on the last point here.
So your evidence is that things improved?
In terms of the ability, the bringing together of all of this information, I think it was all on the table at the relevant points, but the sort of sophistication of that analytical integration did improve through 2020 into 2021, informing the second roadmap, and the nature of the sort of overall government operation in 2021 felt a bit different than it might have done in March 2020, and I suppose that's not necessarily a surprise given the nature of the challenge we faced.
Well, we're now going to demonstrate the economic efficiency use of time. 3 points, 5 minutes. First point is this. Let's open up, please, INQ 000 273 901 at page 373. You've seen it already, and it's really just to assist you in relation to a point I would like to ask you about. So that's 000 273 901, and that should be page 373. And it relates to this, while that's been brought up, as you've seen it already, is that was HMT, to your knowledge, the way that it was pressing economic interests in discussions, did it create an environment where the Treasury and the Chancellor were pejoratively termed as pro-death? Was that a phrase that you heard? I'm not suggesting you used it. You heard being used pejoratively in and around number 10?
I don't recall that phrase, no.
And there is an entry which you've seen, which is in front of you, a hard copy, at a meeting on the 25th of January 2021. The PM is recorded as saying that he wants Tier 3 March the 1st, Tier 2 April the 1st, Tier 1 May the 1st, and nothing by September. And he ends up by saying the team must bring in the pro-death squad from HMT. A meeting, an economic meeting. This is Sir Patrick Vallance's diaries. You've got the entry in front of us. I'm sorry we don't have it on the screen in front of you. But do you recall the phraseology by the Prime Minister referring to HMT as the pro-death squad?
As I say, this I think refers to a meeting a couple of years ago. I don't recall that specific phrase. I mean, I see that this is from Patrick's notebook. I wouldn't dispute what he's recorded, but I don't recall the phrase at all. I mean, is it helpful to say a bit more about what's going on at this time, or do you want to move on?
No, thank you. I'm just asking your recollection. Second penultimate point is the interests of the elderly. In the discussions, especially in the autumn of 2020, do you recall the Prime Minister referring to the interests of the elderly, how effectively older people should accept their fate and tell the young to get on life and the economy going? Was that something in your dialogue with him that emerged in discussions?
Well, I think this is another extract from Patrick's diary on the 26th of August. I mean, I know that.
We can bring that up if you wish. That's INQ 000273.
We don't need to bother. Did you hear it, Mr. Glasgow, or not?
But so, I mean, this is, I think, from a WhatsApp group that I wasn't part of on a date or time when I was on leave, so I don't have awareness of this.
I'd like you to just bear with me and listen to the question a little bit more. I'm not suggesting you're on a WhatsApp group, but Sir Patrick Vallance, in the two extracts you were shown, refers to the word obsessed. The Prime Minister was obsessed by this. Was it a case in as the economic conduit dealing with him, that he ever used that phraseology referring to the interests of the elderly?
Well, no, I don't recall him using.
I'm asking your recollection. It's not written down on a piece of paper.
No. I don't recall. I'm just thinking about that period of time. I don't recall sort of phraseology in the space that I think you're referring to.
Thank you. Last question. And turning back to lessons learned, and one of the matters in that report, which we've touched upon, we don't need to bring this screen up, is whether there should have been an economic or socio-economic equivalent of SAGE to assist decision makers with analysis of the trade-offs of decision making. I'm going to ask your opinion because you were at number 10, now you're back at HMT. What's your view in terms of a recommendation or lessons learned of an economic SAGE, so to speak?
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm aware of the idea. I've seen it come up in some of the other evidence here. I don't think it was something that was ever formally proposed to the Prime Minister, as far as I'm aware, to the Prime Minister, or indeed something that he proposed to the Treasury, as it were. But in terms of my perspective, I think my understanding is that SAGE itself filled a gap that existed in providing sort of scientific advice on the virus, and there's no other element of government that was in place, standing function to do that, and therefore it was obviously necessary for SAGE to take that role. On the economics, the sort of Treasury exists to do that in some sense. You've got a standing economic unit within the Treasury. I didn't see the chief economic advisor's evidence earlier, but I mean, she may have disagreed. You've got the economic who are plugged into the Office of Budget Responsibility, the Bank of England, international groups such as the IMF, the OECD, think tanks, academics. And so in that sense, for the sorts of products we were looking at earlier, like these dashboards, they are bringing together information, data and analysis from all of those sources, following a sort of playbook or way of working that I think that I would recognise from having been in the Treasury previously, and so feels familiar. Now, I can obviously understand, and I think in their corporate witness statement, the Treasury referred to sort of market sensitivities of putting out certain information at certain times. But I mean, my own personal reflection is that in a sort of fast-moving crisis, unprecedented situation such as a pandemic, I could imagine the sharing or testing of some of that work a bit more publicly than might normally take place. So I think the function and the role and the work sort of already exists. It links back to your point on transparency. Yeah.
External transparency. Mr. Glasper, very grateful. My lady, I'm sorry we've encroached beyond lunchtime, but unless you have any questions, that's all I wish to ask.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Glasper. Thank you for your help. And we will break now, and I shall return at 2:05.